Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens and your faithfulness to the clouds. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Episcopal Church of the Ascension. I am glad that you are here this morning as we continue our celebration of the season of Epiphany, where Christ is revealed to us. I begin with a bit of troubling news. Perhaps you've read of the Episcopal Church in your national media this week. The primates, those who lead each national leader of an Anglican body, or those who are united across the globe in this, our historic faith, met, and unfortunately, they have put us a degree of separation between us, let's say. It's not a permanent divide, but it is something that is troubling for those who are accustomed to being a part of a worldwide Anglican communion. It puts us in difference, and I guess there is some good in it. I mean, I do understand that they don't want us to represent the whole Anglican communion as members on committees and boards. That may make sense as we have some fundamental differences. Now, I do think there's good news in it. I think our new presiding bishop, Michael Curry, is absolutely the right person to represent us in this difficult time. And if you're interested in knowing more, I encourage you to read his statements about the matter, because I think in them you'll find hope, expectation, and the love of Christ. Amen. Thank you. Didn't even have to beg for that one. That was beautiful. Well timed. That wasn't even set up, folks. Now, I do think where we find this most troubling is actually very much present in our readings this morning, because we read in Paul of spiritual gifts. And Paul wrote a lot of stuff, folks. I mean, Paul authored almost half of what we find in the New Testament. In terms of letters, there's nobody quite like him. But if he had only written this section and the subsequent readings in Corinthians, he would have done us well, because I mean, and not to say that the other parts aren't helpful to us, but this section in Corinthians I find most helpful. And I think a great many followers of Christ would agree, where he speaks of spiritual gifts, where he speaks the gifts of the whole body. And then he goes on in subsequent weeks. We'll continue this reading in Corinthians, and we'll see how when these works come together, they make a magnificent whole and a glorious thing indeed. And I think we take great delight in that. It continues into the passage of love, which we read at, well, nearly every wedding. But for good reason, because Paul is so articulate about the nature of love in those verses. So we have a lot to look forward as we continue this walk through this season of Epiphany. Now, I think we've done a bit on spiritual gifts here at Ascension. Many of you have taken a spiritual gifts assessment. Many of you are working within those gifts, and I think we are blessed by that, and we experience the blessing. Some probably still struggling to discern or embrace or step forward into those gifts. I can sympathize where it is sometimes challenging, and I think we'll even find some empathy from the Christ we find in 2 John as we enter that story in a bit, in his somewhat reluctant nature to embrace or step forward into the gifts that we've received. Now, I, for one, I've shared a bit of my own story. Many of you already know that I have 3 older sisters. And I have to tell you, with 3 older sisters in particular, there were times where I felt like the spiritual gifts well had come dry by the time I had arrived. Indeed, my sisters have many gifts, and they are extremely talented. They are intelligent. It was, I like to tell it sometimes. I say, they're really smart, and people go, yeah. I say 2 of them were salutatorian of the high school class, and the other were valedictorian, and the other one was the salutatorian. And then I say, I was class president. I guess that's a gift in its own right, but 2 of them can sit at a piano and play what they've just heard by ear. Makes probably most of this room jealous just to hear that. I mean, they have a lot of talents, and there were moments where I wondered what talents I might find eventually someday, because it took me a while to find. And yet, even growing up, there were times where we all went and did the same thing together. Maybe those were the moments where their talents were most stark to me. my parents both felt very strongly that we ought to take swimming lessons as children. And I think that's a great idea. I remember this very starkly because I still remember arriving at the public swimming pool at a very young age and looking at this huge line of people waiting to sign up for swimming lessons and thinking, my parents don't wait in a line like that for anything. So this must be important. And so we were enrolled in swimming lessons, and my sisters, again, they progressed rather rapidly. Two of them swam competitively on swim teams, and I did really well the first year. I stayed above water mostly, and then I think it's the second year, it may have been the third, where you're required to be able to dive into the swimming pool in order to progress. And that was a hang-up for me, I have to say. It was a point of contention between me and the swimming instructor, and then later me and my mother. They try a lot of the same things. They want you to tuck your chin and sit on the side of the pool and just kind of fall head first in. They try making you squat at the side of the pool and try to tuck your head and roll into the pool. They try having you form your hands and follow them into the water. And none of them worked. And I think part of it was the reality. I had some ear trouble as a child. I had tubes in my ears, and I knew that sometimes if I got water in my ear, it didn't just hurt in the moment, but it would hurt all day and even maybe keep me up at night. And, so I did a lot of belly flops because the pain of the water smacking your whole body was less so than the pain, a little bit of pain in the ear would pursue and continue. And so I think I took that same second or third year swimming class, I don't know how many years before my mom finally decided, well, he's not going to drown. So I think we've served the purpose. And it really was one of these cases where I've always been a strong swimmer and not a fast swimmer. And so she conceded that I wouldn't have to continue. But, with three older sisters, sometimes these little things just don't go away because it seemed anytime we gathered at a pool and there were people, inevitably one of them would manage to bring up, Paul can't dive. Sure, it's funny now. And inevitably, again, older sisters, they had boyfriends and other, we had cousins or whomever would be around, and inevitably one of them would make it their personal mission to teach Paul how to dive. And they'd say, and some of them, I could even remember their claims. They'd say, I can have him diving in no time, or I'll have him diving in an hour, I'm sure of it. I'll guarantee that I can teach him how to dive. Of course, the problem, it's kind of like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him dive. No, it's not like that. You don't want to learn to dive in order to dive, though. You have to desire it. And I had no desire. I had no interest in learning how to dive. And therefore, all those promises and guarantees and all those who were going on to be certified dive instructors failed when they attempted to teach little Paul, stretch your imagination, little Paul, how to dive. It wasn't until many, many, many years later that I was at a pool with a bunch of friends, and all of them, they were diving after something. I thought, I can do that. And I took a running at the pool, and I leapt, and I dove head in. And that was the first time I dove. Didn't work with the tuck the chin and in. Didn't work with a sit on the edge. It took a running leap and a jump in. And I think sometimes when we're nervous, that may be the best advice for us is just get a running start, right? Now, how in the world does he relate all this to the Gospel of John? Remember John? We read John not that long ago. Now, John stands in stark contrast to the other Gospels in some profound ways. So we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes referred to as the synoptic Gospels. They work together kind of as a cohesive. While they differ in some places, they are far more alike than they are different. And yet, each has its own gifts to offer us. And I think that bears mentioning because Matthew writes as a man who was raised in Judaism, a man who sees Jesus as the long-anticipated Messiah of which the prophets wrote. Matthew writes in the sense that Jesus is completing a great number of things and includes that in his gospel. Mark is concerned with the urgency with which Jesus offers his message, the urgency and immediacy of the actions, and indeed the actions are what drives Mark forward. It's the shortest, but it comes first to us because Mark authors this gospel in haste to make sure that it's recorded and offered to the world. Luke writes in a different capacity. He writes as a Gentile who's come to know the salvation, love, mercy, and grace of God through Jesus, not having grown up in Judaism. And he writes, highly intelligent man, a physician in his time, and writes not only the Gospel of Luke, but also the book of Acts, which captures the early years of the church. John is authored last, and he sets out, I think, with a somewhat different mission in trying to capture what happens with Jesus. John begins with majestic poetry that paints a picture of the Word made flesh, a Christ, a Messiah that exists from the beginning of time, not something that's created later as God's solution to a problem of communicating with God's people, but something envisioned from the very beginning and only offered up to us at a particular moment in time. And John captures that well in his first chapter. And then as we read through John seems less concerned with the linear nature of events that maybe progressed in a certain fashion, but instead writes with a theological and literary capacity that the others seem less concerned with. And so when we read John, it's helpful to compare, but it's also helpful to know what sets John apart and makes John glorious. Now, John includes this story in the wedding of Cana in part as a series of events that link all of these profound institutions of Judaism, weddings being one major step in a person's life, and offers up Jesus' connection to that, his connection to the sacred rites that were offered in Judaism. Now, John marks this miracle, if you will, sign is what John says, as the first sign of his divine nature. Now, some criticize John. After all, Matthew, Mark, Luke all write of healings, of casting out demons first. Mark, in fast sequence, making sure we capture not one but two or three, all right away in the first chapter. Matthew and Luke, they have the genealogies first, so it takes them a little while to get to those. But the miracles that they're offered, and that is the word that the other gospel writers use, is miracle. And they offer casting out of demons and the healing of the sick first. John offers the first half of his gospel to the signs by which we'll know that Christ is the Messiah. He plants this first one at Jesus' mother's encouragement at a major institution in Cana. Now, it is fascinating. John 3 times references Jesus' mother, but not her name. It's because the title of mother is more important than name. The title of mother carries a certain authority still for us, does it not? And it's Jesus' mother who offers up encouragement to Jesus, that he might perform a sign, that he might save this new couple from the embarrassment and the stigma of having been the ones who ran out of wine at their celebration, a celebration during which they were expected to provide for their community. This is not some trick that's offered up that they might have an extra glass of wine. This is a saving grace in its own right of sorts. And by it, the disciples who've already committed to following Jesus know that something different is happening in him. They know that his divine nature will lead them places that they didn't expect when they first committed to following him. And I think it's also very telling that John captures the nature of this, that he says not just that the disciples were convinced that by the divine nature of this, but the servants also. It's not the head steward. It's not the bride and groom. It's not the party guests that are all made known what has happened. It's the disciples who've committed their lives and the servants who know of what's happening. Now, I suspect for many of us, even when we recognize our spiritual gifts and discern them, we're sometimes reluctant to dive head first into the water. I imagine that it is challenging, that we may fear the pain of embarrassment, or worse, as we contemplate what might happen if we thrust ourselves headlong into an endeavor, even when we know that God has offered us gifts in it. My prayer for us, the people of Ascension, is that we might leap with a running head start and do what Jesus asks. Amen.